She thought it was just a routine traffic stop, until she saw the tattoo that made her blood run cold. The red and blue lights flashed against the damp pavement as Officer Rebecca Hayes eased her patrol car to a stop behind the black SUV. The vehicle had been going 7 miles over the limit, nothing worth a second thought on most nights, but something about the way it veered slightly before braking caught her attention. She sighed, rolling her shoulders to shake off the tension creeping in. It had been a long shift, the kind that made her question why she hadn't just taken the desk job her supervisor kept pushing on her. But no, Rebecca wasn't built for paperwork. She liked the road, the unpredictability, the feeling that at any moment, the smallest thing could turn into something bigger. Still, this was routine. It had to be. Hand resting on her holster, she pushed her door open and stepped out, boots crunching against the gravelly shoulder of the road. The air carried the familiar scent of exhaust and damp asphalt, a leftover from the light rain that had passed through earlier. The driver hadn't moved. His hands were locked on the steering wheel, fingers gripping tight enough to make his knuckles stand out against his dark skin. She took her time approaching. Something was off. Most drivers fumbled for their license, peeked into their mirrors, or did something other than sit completely still, like they were bracing for impact. She stopped just short of the driver's side window. He hadn't even rolled it down. Rebecca rapped her knuckles against the glass, her voice steady. "Evening, sir. License and registration, please." A slow, almost deliberate movement. He reached toward the glove compartment with one hand, keeping the other in plain sight. Good. He knew the drill. The window slid down just enough for her to get a look at him. Early 40s, sharp features, eyes dark and unreadable, no smell of alcohol, no slurred speech, just controlled, precise movements. Still, something about him didn't sit right. "Mind telling me where you're headed tonight?" she asked, keeping her tone casual. The man didn't answer right away. His fingers tapped once against the steering wheel before he slid the registration toward her. "Just passing through." Its voice was calm. Too calm. Rebecca took the documents, her eyes flicking over them. Brandon Ellis. The name didn't ring any bells, but she'd check the system in a minute. Then she saw it. The sleeve of his jacket had slipped back just enough to reveal a tattoo on his forearm. A simple circular design, inked in faded black. At first it didn't fully register, but then her stomach clenched. She knew that symbol. She'd seen it before. Once, and that was all it took for the air to feel like it had been sucked out of her lungs. A memory, buried deep, ripped its way to the surface. A night at the academy. A story whispered among the officers, passed down like some urban legend. Except it wasn't. A group of officers had vanished. No bodies, no explanations. Just gone. And the only thing they left behind, a mark. That mark. Rebecca's grip on the registration tightened. She needed to stay calm, but the man had noticed her hesitation. She could feel his eyes on her, watching, waiting. His voice was level when he finally spoke. "Something wrong, officer?" Her throat felt dry. She could hear the static of the radio behind her, the distant hum of passing cars. But all of it faded beneath the weight of one overwhelming thought. This was no coincidence. Something was very, very wrong, but she wasn't ready for what would happen next. Rebecca's pulse hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face neutral. Years on the force had taught her one thing. Never let them see you hesitate. She forced herself to glance at the tattoo just once more, confirming what her gut already knew. It was the same symbol she had seen years ago in a case that never made the news. The kind that got buried so deep even the department stopped asking questions. Her mind flashed back to 2009, the night she first heard about it. She was still a rookie then, barely a year into her training. A few veteran officers had been talking in the break room, their voices hushed. A squad from a neighboring precinct had gone on a call, some anonymous tip about a suspect hiding out in an abandoned house. The officers went in. The radio cut out. None of them came back. When reinforcements arrived, the house was empty, except for that symbol, burned into the floorboards. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle. Just that mark. Rebecca had asked about it once, and the sergeant shut her down so fast it was like she had spoken something forbidden. Some things don't have explanations, Hayes. Let it go, and so she did. Until now. Now, That symbol wasn't just a ghost story whispered between cops who drank too much. It was sitting in front of her. Her grip on the registration was too tight. She forced herself to relax, breathing through her nose. Stay in control. She tapped the roof of the SUV, feigning nonchalance. Wait here. She turned and walked back to her cruiser, forcing herself not to rush. Every step felt heavier than the last. Something in her gut told her she needed to act carefully, because this man was watching her just as closely as she was watching him. Sliding into the driver's seat, she locked the door and reached for the onboard computer. Brandon Ellis. The name was too clean. No priors, no parking tickets, not even a warning on record. That wasn't normal. Everyone had something. Even the most law-abiding citizens had a paper trail. A library card, a voter registration, a job history. But Brandon Ellis, he was a ghost. She tapped the dashboard thinking, if he was connected to what happened back then, she needed backup. She reached for her radio. Dispatch, this is Officer Hayes. Run an extended background check on her. A sudden movement from the SUV. Rebecca's hand hovered over her gun as she flicked her eyes up. The driver hadn't moved, but his passenger door was unlocked. She hadn't heard the sound. She would have sworn she locked eyes with him the entire time, but it was open. And suddenly, she wasn't just dealing with a routine stop anymore. The SUV's brake lights flickered as the engine rumbled to life. Rebecca's stomach turned cold. He was about to run, but she couldn't let him. Rebecca didn't think. She acted. Her hand shot to her radio. Dispatch, I have a possible runner on. The SUV's tires screeched against the asphalt. Her training took over. Rebecca slammed the gear shift into drive and hit the gas. Her cruiser lurched forward, kicking up loose gravel as she gunned it after him. The SUV swerved onto the highway, headlights bouncing across the dark stretch of road ahead. He was running. That told her everything she needed to know. Innocent people don't run. Not like this. Not with that kind of instinctual precision, like he'd done this before. She gritted her teeth and gripped the wheel. Dispatch, suspect is fleeing southbound on Route 43. Black SUV, no plates on the rear, requesting immediate backup. Her siren wailed into the night, cutting through the thick tension that had settled in her chest. She could feel it now. The weight of something bigger pressing down on her. Brandon Ellis wasn't just a guy with an expired registration. He wasn't even supposed to exist. The SUV veered hard to the right, cutting through an empty rest stop, skidding just enough for Rebecca to see his face in the side mirror. He wasn't panicked. He was calculating. That unsettled her more than the tattoo, more than the missing officers, more than any of it. This wasn't a desperate escape. It was controlled, purposeful, like he knew exactly where he was going. Rebecca's tires shrieked as she followed him, barely keeping him in sight as he cut across an access road. Damn it, he was fast. But she had two advantages. Her cruiser was built for this, and she knew these roads better than most. She reached for the radio again. I need units at... The SUV's headlights vanished. She blinked, momentarily stunned. Where the hell did he go? She eased off the gas just slightly, eyes scanning the road ahead. No turnoffs, no exits. There was nowhere he could have gone that fast. Her heart pounded in her ears. She slowed down just enough to take a better look at her surroundings. Empty fields on both sides. No houses. No visible side roads. And then, a set of faint tire marks veering off the road to the right. Rebecca narrowed her eyes. He'd gone off-road. That wasn't the move of a scared suspect. That was the move of a man who knew exactly where he was going. And that terrified her. But she wasn't turning back now. Rebecca gripped the wheel, forcing herself to breathe evenly. Think. The SUV had vanished off the main road, its trail marked only by faint tire impressions in the dirt. There was no sign of movement, no flicker of brake lights in the distance, just darkness stretching ahead. Every instinct screamed at her to wait for backup, but backup wouldn't get here fast enough. And if she let him slip away now, she might never find out who he really was, or what he was hiding. She guided the cruiser onto the dirt path, headlights cutting across the uneven terrain. The earth was still damp from the rain, the ground soft enough to hold the marks of the SUV's tires. He had to be close. But as she drove deeper, a familiar uneasiness settled in her chest. This place. She had been here before. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened, as her mind flashed back to the past. 12 years ago. A case she was never supposed to be assigned to. She was still new to the force, still naive enough to believe that every case had a clean resolution, that justice always won. It started with a missing officer, a patrolman who radioed in for a routine welfare check at an old farmstead just outside city limits. Then he went silent. When the department sent reinforcements, they found nothing. No car, no body, no signs of struggle. Except for that damn symbol, burned into the barn's rotting wooden door. And now, years later, miles away, she was staring at it again. Her headlights illuminated the same mark. It was carved into the side of an abandoned storage shed just ahead, the faded wood barely holding its shape against time. The SUV was parked just beside it. Engine off. No movement. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a setup. She reached for her radio, forcing steel into her voice. "Dispatch, I have located the suspect's vehicle. Requesting immediate backup at..." Voice from the darkness. Low. Steady. Too close. "You shouldn't have followed me, officer." She spun, hand flying to her holster. But she was too late. Rebecca barely had time to react. A shadow moved just beyond the reach of her headlights, and before she could draw her weapon, a hand gripped her wrist. Hard. Instinct took over. She twisted, yanking her arm free as she stumbled back, drawing her gun in one fluid motion. Her heart pounded, her breath shallow. But her hands stayed steady. Brandon Ellis stood just outside the reach of her cruiser's beams. His face was partially illuminated, and for the first time, she saw him clearly. Calm, expression unreadable. But it wasn't just his lack of fear that unsettled her. It was the way he watched her. Like he had been expecting this. He raised his hand slowly. "I'm not armed, officer." Rebecca didn't lower her gun. "Get on the ground. Now." A flicker of something. Amusement crossed his face. "If I wanted to hurt you, I could have done it back on the road." A pulse hammered, but she didn't let it show. "Don't engage. Control the situation. I won't say it again." She stepped forward, keeping her aim steady. Face down, hands behind your head. Brandon exhaled through his nose, then he did exactly as she asked. Something felt wrong. He wasn't resisting, wasn't running. It was too easy. She reached for her radio. "Dispatch, I have the suspect in custody." Static. Becca stiffened. No response. She checked her radio, adjusting the dial. Nothing. Like the signal had been cut. A slow realization settled over her. She was on her own. Brandon spoke. Voice steady, almost too casual for a man in his position. "You don't remember me, do you?" Rebecca froze. Her mind raced, sifting through old cases, old faces. But nothing matched. "I've never met you before," she said, voice firm. Brandon let out a breath, a knowing breath. Like he had expected her to say that. "You should have left it alone," he murmured. But now, it's too late. A chill ran through her, not from fear, but from something deeper. Recognition. There was truth in his voice. And suddenly, Rebecca knew. This wasn't about the traffic stop. This was about her. She wasn't the one hunting him. He had been waiting for her all along. But why? Rebecca's mind worked fast. He knew her. That meant this wasn't random. The stop, the chase, the way he let her catch him. It was all planned. She kept her gun trained on him. But now her voice had a new edge. "You're going to tell me what's going on," she ordered. "And you're going to do it now." Brandon didn't move. His face remained impassive. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of memory, of recognition. "You already know," he said. Rebecca's jaw clenched. No, she didn't. But her gut told her she should. "I don't have time for games," she snapped. "You ran, you resisted. And now you're talking in riddles." Brandon shifted just slightly. "I ran because I needed to make sure you followed." Her grip on the gun tightened. "Why?" His gaze held hers, steady. Too steady. "Because they lied to you, Officer Hayes." Her breath caught. Every muscle in her body locked in place. She didn't want to ask, didn't want to give weight to his words. But some part of her, the part that had never stopped wondering, needed to know. "Who lied to me?" she demanded. Brandon's jaw tensed. He hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything. because whoever it was, he was afraid of them. Rebecca's mind raced back to the missing officers, the ones the department stopped talking about, the ones who disappeared without a trace. Her superiors told her to forget, and she did, because it was easier than asking the questions no one wanted to answer. But now, standing in the dark, facing a man she was supposed to arrest, Rebecca felt something she hadn't in years, a nagging certainty, the feeling that something had been off all along. Brandon swallowed hard, then spoke. They didn't just disappear. Rebecca's blood ran cold. She didn't want to hear the rest. But she had no choice. Because whatever he was about to say, it was going to change everything. Rebecca's breath felt tight in her chest, like something heavy had settled there. They didn't just disappear. Brandon's words echoed in her head, but she wasn't ready to accept them. Not yet. "You're lying," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "You're trying to mess with me." Brandon didn't flinch. "Am I?" Her gun was still trained on him, but she wasn't sure why anymore. If you wanted to hurt her, he would have done it by now. She exhaled sharply. "Start talking. From the beginning." Brandon slowly shifted to sit on his knees, still keeping his hands visible. "It started long before you ever put on that uniform," he said. "Your department has secrets, Officer Hayes. The kind they bury so deep, they hope no one ever digs them up." Rebecca kept her stance firm, but her mind was already working. What was he talking about? Brandon continued. 12 years ago, a unit of officers was sent to investigate an abandoned property. They were supposed to bring in a suspect, a routine operation. Rebecca swallowed. She knew this part. "They never came back," she said quietly. Brandon nodded. "That's what they told you." He paused. "But what if I told you some of them did come back?" Rebecca stiffened. "Oh, that wasn't possible." "If that were true, there would be a record," she said. "Someone would have said something." Brandon let out a slow, humorless chuckle. "You really think they'd leave proof?" Rebecca hated that she didn't have an answer. Brandon leaned forward slightly. They weren't just officers. They were part of something else. Something bigger. The ones who survived. They weren't allowed to talk. A wave of unease crept up Rebecca's spine. "What do you mean, allowed?" Brandon's jaw tightened. "You ever wonder why no one questions it? Why no families demanded answers? Why every single person who ever looked into it just stopped?" Rebecca felt a knot in her stomach. Brandon's eyes locked onto hers. "Because they were made to stop." She clenched her teeth. "That doesn't make sense." But even as she said it, her mind was racing back to every time she had asked about that night. The way her questions had been shut down. The way the case had been erased like it never existed. Brandon's voice was low, steady, too steady. "You think this is about me?" He shook his head. "It's about you." Rebecca's breath caught. "What?" Brandon exhaled. "You were supposed to be one of them." A chill passed through her. "One of who?" Brandon looked at her like he was waiting for her to put it together. "You were meant to be on that case, weren't you?" Rebecca's stomach turned. She was. 12 years ago she had been on that rotation. She should have been on that call. But at the last second, she was reassigned. She had never questioned why. Until now. Brandon's voice dropped lower. "They didn't save you. They spared you." Becca's grip on her gun faltered. Because deep down she knew. He wasn't lying. And that meant everything she believed was a lie. Rebecca's hands ached from gripping the gun too tightly. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, but everything else, the night air, the sound of her own breath, felt eerily still. Brandon didn't move. He was waiting. Waiting for her to decide. She had spent her whole career believing in the system. In rules, in justice, in the idea that the badge she wore meant something. But now, standing in the middle of nowhere, face to face with a man who shouldn't exist, she realized. Maybe she had been wrong all along. Maybe justice wasn't about following orders. Maybe it was about seeing the truth, even when it terrified you. She exhaled slowly, lowered her gun. Brandon's shoulders relaxed just slightly, but he didn't look relieved. He looked prepared. "You're making the right call," he said. Rebecca shook her head. "No." She kept her voice steady. I'm making my own call. For the first time all night, Brandon smiled. But the moment was short-lived. A set of distant headlights appeared over the hill. Rebecca's stomach dropped. Brandon tensed. They found me. The backup she had called earlier. It wasn't coming for her. It was coming for him. Rebecca had two choices. Let them take him, or do something that would change her life forever. Brandon met her eyes. If they take me, I don't make it out alive. And somehow she already knew that was true. Her grip tightened on her radio. She had spent years asking the wrong questions. Now she had the answer. And it was time to act. Rebecca had spent her whole career believing the truth would always reveal itself. Tonight she learned, sometimes you have to fight for it. But the real question is, would you? When faced with a choice between what's right and what's easy, would you risk everything for the truth? Because sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules, and not everyone is brave enough to make that choice. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and leave your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Rebecca's place? Let's talk about it.